It's 1961, and a young black woman walks into a courtroom in the Deep South. She's dressed in her finest suit, carrying law books that seem to weigh more than she does, and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong. Somewhere, even when everyone else thinks you don single quotes T. As she approaches the defense table, whispers ripple through the courtroom. Who is that? What's she doing here? And then, the comment that would echo through decades of American legal history. She doesn't look like a lawyer. The person who said those words had no idea they were speaking to Constance Baker Motley, the woman who would become the first black female federal judge in American history. The lawyer who won 9 out of 10 cases she argued before the Supreme Court, and the legal mastermind who wrote the original complaint for Brown v. Board of Education. They saw a black woman and couldn't imagine her as a lawyer. What they didn't see was the brilliant legal mind that would dismantle segregation brick by brick, the courageous advocate who would face down the Ku Klux Klan to defend civil rights, and the trailblazer who would open doors for generations of women and people of color in the legal profession. This isn't just a story about one woman's triumph over prejudice. It's a story about how assumptions can blind us to greatness, how stereotypes can mask genius, and how the most unlikely heroes can change the course of history. It's about a woman who was told she didn't look like a lawyer, but who helped rewrite the very definition of what justice looks like in America. Constance Baker Motley's story will challenge everything you think you know about power, about prejudice, and about the quiet revolutions that happen in courtrooms when brilliant minds refuse to be silenced. Constance Baker was born on September 14, 1921, in New Haven, Connecticut, the 9th of 12 children in a family that valued education above all else. Her father, Willoughby Alva Baker, was a chef at Yale University, and her mother, Rachel Huggins Baker, was a founder of the New Haven chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Baker household was one where intellectual curiosity was encouraged. Civil rights was a dinner-table conversation, and the belief that education could change the world was passed down like a family heirloom. Growing up in the 1920s and 1930s, Constance experienced what she later described as a childhood largely free of overt racism. New Haven, while not perfect, was more progressive than many American cities of that era. The Baker children attended integrated schools, and while they certainly faced discrimination, it wasn't the suffocating, legally mandated segregation that defined life in the South. But Constance's first real encounter with Jim Crow came during a train ride to college in Tennessee. As the train crossed the Mason-Dixon line, she was forced to move to the colored car, a jarring introduction to the legal system of segregation that would define her life's work. The humiliation of that moment, the arbitrary cruelty of being treated as less than human simply because of the color of her skin, crystallized her understanding of what the law could do to people and what it could do for them. At Fisk University, Constance studied economics and was planning to become a businesswoman. But fate intervened in the form of Clarence Blakely, a wealthy white businessman who was impressed by a speech she gave at a local meeting. Blakely offered to pay for her law school education, an offer that would change not just Constance's life, but the trajectory of American civil rights law. In 1944, Constance entered Columbia Law School, one of only a handful of black students and one of even fewer women. The legal profession in the 1940s was overwhelmingly white and male, a gentlemen's club where women and people of color were tolerated at best, actively excluded at worst. Law schools had only recently begun admitting women, and many professors. And students made it clear that they viewed female law students as curiosities rather than serious future lawyers. For black women, the barriers were even higher. The American legal system had been designed by white men to protect white male interests, and the idea of a black woman wielding legal authority was almost unthinkable to many. The few black women who had attempted to practice law in the previous decades had faced crushing discrimination, like Charlotte E. Ray, the first black female lawyer in America, who was forced to close her practice because she couldn't attract enough clients willing to be represented by a black woman. The racial climate of the 1940s was defined by the contradiction between America's rhetoric of freedom and democracy and the reality of Jim Crow segregation. World War II had just ended, and black veterans were returning home to find that the democracy they had fought to defend abroad was denied to them at home. The NAACP was beginning to develop its legal strategy to challenge segregation through the courts, understanding that the law could be a weapon against injustice. Just as surely as it had been a tool of oppression, it was in this context that Constance Baker Motley began her legal career. In 1946, while still a law student, she began working as a law clerk for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she encountered Thurgood Marshall, the legendary civil rights lawyer who would become her mentor and collaborator. Marshall recognized Motley's brilliance immediately. Here was a young woman who combined exceptional legal skills with an unshakable moral compass and the kind of courage that doesn't come from books. It comes from understanding that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Under Marshall's guidance, Motley began to understand that the law wasn't just about statutes and precedents. It was about human dignity, about the fundamental American promise that all people are created equal. By the time she graduated from Columbia Law School in 1946, Constance Baker Motley had already begun the work that would define her career, using the law as a tool for justice, wielding legal precedent as a weapon against prejudice, and proving that a black woman could not only look like a lawyer, she could be one of the greatest lawyers in American history. The case that would forever change Constance Baker Motley's life began with a simple application to the University of Mississippi. In 1961, James Meredith, a black Air Force veteran, applied for admission to Ole Miss, the state's flagship university. His application was rejected not because of his grades or qualifications, but because of his race. Mississippi's segregated higher education system had never admitted a black student, and Governor Ross Barnett was determined to keep it that way. When Meredith contacted the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for help, the case landed on Constance Baker Motley's desk. At 40 years old, she was already a veteran civil rights lawyer with an impressive track record. She had worked on Brown v. Board of Education, successfully desegregated lunch counters and restaurants across the South, and had defended Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s right to march. But the Meredith case would test her in ways she had never experienced before. The legal strategy was straightforward. Argue that the University of Mississippi's exclusion of black students violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But the reality of litigating in Mississippi in 1961 was anything but straightforward. This was the heart of the segregated South, where white supremacy wasn't just a belief system. It was the law, the culture, and the economic foundation of society. Motley's first court appearance in the Meredith case took place in Meridian, Mississippi, in June 1961. As she walked into the federal courthouse, she could feel the weight of hostile stares. The courthouse was packed with white spectators who had come to see the uppity Negro woman who dared to challenge their way of life. Court officers looked at her with barely concealed contempt, and several white lawyers made no effort to hide their disdain. The moment that would define the case and Motley's career came when she approached the bench to begin her opening argument. U.S. District Judge Sidney Mize, a Mississippi native who had been appointed to the federal bench, looked at her with barely concealed incredulity. As she began to speak, he interrupted her. "Young lady," Judge Mize said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of the Delta, "you don't look like a lawyer to me." Are you sure you're in the right place? The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter. Some of the white spectators clapped. The opposing counsel, a team of white male lawyers representing the University of Mississippi, smirked openly. In that moment, Motley understood that she wasn't just fighting for James Meredith's right to attend the University of Mississippi. She was fighting for her own right to be taken seriously as a lawyer, as a woman, as a human being. But Constance Baker Motley had faced prejudice before. She had been the only black woman in rooms full of white men more times than she could count. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and condescended to by judges, opposing counsel, and court personnel throughout her career. What made this moment different was not just the public nature of the humiliation, but the stakes involved. Instead of backing down, Motley drew herself up to her full height and looked Judge Mize directly in the eye. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I am Constance Baker Motley, attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I have been admitted to practice before this court, and I am here to represent Mr. James Meredith in his suit against the University of Mississippi. I look exactly like what I am, a lawyer fighting for justice." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Mize, perhaps realizing that his comments had crossed a line, grudgingly allowed her to proceed. But the damage was done. The message was clear. In the eyes of the legal establishment, a black woman could not be a real lawyer. The legal proceedings that followed were a masterclass in both legal brilliance and institutionalized racism. Motley presented a meticulous case, documenting Mississippi's systematic exclusion of black students from higher education and demonstrating that Meredith was more than qualified for admission. She called expert witnesses, presented statistical evidence, and made constitutional arguments that were both scholarly and passionate. But at every turn, she faced obstacles that her white male colleagues never encountered. Court reporters accidentally failed to record her statements. Bailiffs claimed they couldn't find her legal briefs. Local hotels refused to provide her with accommodation, forcing her to drive hours to find a place to stay. Restaurant owners turned her away, leaving her to eat crackers and peanut butter in her hotel room. The opposing counsel, led by Mississippi Attorney General Joe Patterson, made no attempt to hide their contempt for Motley. They consistently referred to her as that woman rather than counselor or attorney. They interrupted her arguments, objected to her presence in the courtroom, and made snide comments about her appearance and demeanor. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when one of the opposing lawyers, during a recess, approached her and said, "You know, if you really cared about your people, you'd stop this nonsense and go back to whatever it is you colored women do. You're just making things harder for everyone." The psychological toll of these encounters was immense. Motley later wrote about the loneliness of being the only black woman in hostile courtrooms, the exhaustion of having to prove her competence again and again, and the constant fear for her physical safety. She received death threats, had to travel with bodyguards, and was constantly aware that her presence in these courtrooms was seen as a threat to the established order. But she persisted. Every day she returned to the courtroom, filed her motions, made her arguments, and fought for James Meredith's right to an education. She understood that this case was about more than one man's admission to one university. It was about the fundamental principle that American higher education could not be segregated by race. On June 25, 1962, after more than a year of legal battles, Judge Mize finally ruled in favor of Meredith, ordering the University of Mississippi to admit him. It was a victory that had cost Motley months of her life, untold emotional energy, and countless moments of humiliation and doubt, but the victory was incomplete. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett refused to comply with the court order setting up a confrontation that would require federal intervention. The case was far from over, and Motley knew that the real test was yet to come. As she left the courthouse that day, Motley reflected on Judge Mize's words from more than a year earlier. "You don't look like a lawyer." She had proven that she didn't just look like a lawyer. She was one of the best lawyers in America. But the fight for recognition, respect, and justice was far from over. The months following the initial court victory in the Meredith case were among the most challenging of Constance Baker Motley's career. What should have been a straightforward implementation of a federal court order became a battle for the soul of American democracy, with Motley at the center of a storm that would test her resolve, her courage, and her faith in the legal system. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett's refusal to comply with the court order created a constitutional crisis. Barnett, a die-hard segregationist who had campaigned on a platform of maintaining the Mississippi way of life, declared that he would personally block Meredith's enrollment, even if it meant defying federal authority. He appointed himself as the university's registrar and vowed to go to jail rather than allow integration. For Motley, Barnett's defiance represented more than just legal obstruction. It was a direct challenge to the rule of law and the principle that federal courts could enforce constitutional rights. She found herself fighting not just for James Meredith's admission to the university, but for the fundamental idea that the Constitution applied to all Americans, regardless of race. The legal strategy required multiple trips to federal court, each time facing increasingly hostile crowds and escalating threats. On one trip to Jackson, Mississippi, Motley's car was surrounded by a mob of white supremacists who recognized her from newspaper photographs. They rocked her car, shouted racial slurs, and threatened to kill her if she didn't leave the state. Only the intervention of federal marshals allowed her to escape unharmed. The psychological pressure was relentless. Motley received dozens of death threats, both at her office in New York and at the hotels where she stayed in Mississippi. Letters arrived filled with racist vitriol, promising violence against her and her family. The FBI, overwhelmed by the scope of the threats, could offer only limited protection. But perhaps more damaging than the overt threats was the subtle, persistent discrimination she faced within the legal profession itself. Even lawyers who privately supported integration often treated her as an outsider, a curiosity rather than a colleague. At legal conferences and bar association meetings, she was frequently the only black person and almost always the only black woman. Conversations would stop when she entered rooms, and her opinions were often dismissed or ignored. The strain began to affect her health and her family life. Motley's husband, Joel Wilson Motley III, worried constantly about her safety. Their young son, Joel Jr., began having nightmares about his mother being hurt. The demands of the case meant that Motley was away from home for weeks at a time, living in hotels, eating solitary meals, and fighting battles that seemed to grow more difficult with each passing day. The breaking point came on September 20th, 1962, when James Meredith attempted to register for classes at the University of Mississippi. Motley had spent months preparing for this moment, coordinating with federal officials, reviewing legal precedents, and developing contingency plans. But nothing could have prepared her for the violence that erupted on the Ole Miss campus. Governor Barnett personally blocked Meredith's entry to the registrar's office, surrounded by a mob of angry whites who had come to defend the university from integration. The scene was chaotic and dangerous, with federal marshals struggling to maintain order as the crowd grew increasingly hostile. Motley watched from a distance as her client, the man she had fought so hard to help, was turned away by the governor of Mississippi. The legal defeat was devastating, but what happened next was even worse. As news of the failed registration attempt spread, Motley became the target of intensified hatred. Mississippi newspapers published her photograph alongside articles describing her as a communist agitator and an enemy of the South. Radio stations broadcast her hotel location, essentially inviting violence against her. That evening, alone in her hotel room in Jackson, Motley experienced what she later described as the darkest moment of her career. The phone rang constantly, with death threats. She could hear crowds gathering outside the hotel, and she realized that her life was in genuine danger. For the first time since she had begun practicing law, she seriously considered giving up. But then she thought about James Meredith, a young man whose only crime was wanting an education. She thought about the thousands of black students across the South who were being denied their constitutional rights. She thought about the little black girls who would never have the opportunity to become lawyers if people like her didn't fight to keep the doors open. The next morning, Motley returned to federal court to file contempt charges against Governor Barnett. Her appearance in court was met with jeers and catcalls from the packed gallery, but she pressed forward with her arguments. U.S. Court of Appeals Judge John Minor Wisdom, one of the few Southern judges who consistently supported civil rights, listened intently to her presentation. "Mrs. Motley," Judge Wisdom said after she finished her argument, "you have presented this case with the skill and dedication that this court has come to expect from you. The rule of law will prevail in Mississippi, and your client will be enrolled at the University of Mississippi." The words were a lifeline. Here was a federal judge who saw her as a lawyer first, not as a black woman who didn't look like a lawyer. His recognition of her professional competence gave her the strength to continue fighting. The final breakthrough came when President John F. Kennedy federalized the Mississippi National Guard and ordered them to escort Meredith to his registration. On October 1, 1962, accompanied by federal marshals and National Guard troops, James Meredith finally enrolled at the University of Mississippi. The victory came at a tremendous cost. 2 people were killed in the riots that followed Meredith's enrollment, and hundreds were injured. The campus was torn apart by violence, and the images of federal troops escorting a black student to class were broadcast around the world. Constance Baker Motley had proven something important, that the law, when enforced with courage and determination, could overcome even the most entrenched systems of discrimination. She had shown that a black woman could stand up to governors, mobs, and the entire structure of white supremacy and win. The morning of October 1st, 1962, dawned gray and tense in Oxford, Mississippi. Federal marshals had surrounded the University of Mississippi campus, and the National Guard was positioned at strategic points throughout the town. After months of legal battles, violent confrontations, and national attention, James Meredith was finally going to register for classes at Ole Miss. Constance Baker Motley stood in the federal courthouse in New Orleans, 400 miles away from Oxford. But her mind was entirely focused on what was happening on that campus. She had spent the night coordinating with federal officials, reviewing legal precedents, and preparing for every possible scenario. This was the moment that would define not just the Meredith case, but her entire career. The phone rang at 9:47 a.m. On the other end was Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, calling from the campus of the University of Mississippi. "Mrs. Motley," Katzenbach said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and disbelief, "James Meredith is officially enrolled at the University of Mississippi. He's registered for classes, he has his student ID, and he's about to walk into his first class as a student at Ole Miss." For a moment, Motley couldn't speak. After 18 months of legal battles, death threats, and humiliation, she had won. Not just won, she had achieved something that many thought was impossible. She had desegregated the University of Mississippi, but Katzenbach wasn't finished. "Mrs. Motley, I want you to know that what you accomplished here goes far beyond this. One case, you've shown that the federal courts can enforce civil rights law even in the most hostile environments. You've proven that the Constitution applies to all Americans, regardless of race. And you've demonstrated that a black woman can be one of the finest lawyers in America." The words hit Motley like a physical blow. For so long, she had been told that she didn't look like a lawyer, that she didn't belong in courtrooms, that she was fighting battles she couldn't win. Now the Deputy Attorney General of the United States was telling her that she had not only won, she had changed the country. The victory in the Meredith case was more than just a legal precedent. It was a turning point in American history. The integration of the University of Mississippi proved that the federal government would enforce civil rights law, even when it meant confronting state governments and violent mobs. It demonstrated that the legal strategy pioneered by Thurgood Marshall and refined by lawyers like Motley could dismantle segregation institution by institution. But for Motley personally, the victory represented something even more significant. It was vindication of her decision to become a lawyer, proof that her years of struggle and sacrifice had been worthwhile. Every time she had been told she didn't look like a lawyer, every time she had been dismissed or condescended to, every time she had doubted herself, all of it had led to this moment. The phone rang again. This time it was James Meredith himself, calling from his dormitory room at the University of Mississippi. "Mrs. Motley," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I'm sitting in my room at Ole Miss. I'm a student at the University of Mississippi. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Motley found herself crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had helped change someone's life in the most fundamental way possible. James Meredith would graduate from the University of Mississippi, earn his degree, and go on to become a civil rights leader. But more than that, his presence at Ole Miss would make it possible for thousands of other black students to attend the university in the years to come. The victory also had national implications that extended far beyond Mississippi. The successful integration of Ole Miss sent a clear message to segregated institutions across the South. The federal government would enforce civil rights law, and legal challenges to segregation would succeed. Within months, other universities across the South began admitting black students rather than face the kind of federal intervention that had occurred in Mississippi. But perhaps the most important impact of the Meredith case was what it meant for the legal profession itself. Constance Baker Motley had proven that a black woman could handle the most challenging, high-profile, and dangerous civil rights cases. She had shown that excellence in the law was not determined by race or gender, but by skill, courage, and dedication. The case that had begun with a judge telling her she didn't look like a lawyer had ended with her being recognized as one of the most effective civil rights lawyers in American history. She had taken the words meant to diminish her and transformed them into a source of strength and motivation. As Motley hung up the phone that morning, she knew that her life's work was far from over. There were still countless battles to fight, countless barriers to break down, countless young people who needed advocates. But she also knew that she had proven something important, that looking like a lawyer was far less important than being a lawyer, and she was one of the best lawyers in America. The victory in the Meredith case transformed Constance Baker Motley from a skilled civil rights lawyer into a national figure, but it also marked the beginning of an even more remarkable phase of her career. The woman who had been told she didn't look like a lawyer would go on to become the first black woman federal judge in American history, serving with distinction on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York for over 30 years. The immediate aftermath of the Ole Miss integration was both triumphant and sobering. James Meredith successfully completed his degree, graduating from the University of Mississippi in 1963 with a bachelor's degree in political science. His presence on campus, while initially met with hostility and violence, gradually became accepted as other students focused on their studies. The walls of segregation in higher education began to crumble throughout the South, as other universities quietly began admitting black students rather than face the kind of federal intervention that had occurred in Mississippi. For Motley, the success of the Meredith case opened doors that had previously been closed to black women in the legal profession. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, consulted by government officials on civil rights policy, and recognized by legal organizations that had previously ignored her work. The American Bar Association, which had a shameful history of excluding black lawyers, began to acknowledge her contributions to the legal profession, but recognition within the legal establishment was just one measure of Motley's impact. By 1965, when she left the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to enter politics, she had won 29 out of 32 civil rights cases, including 9 out of 10 cases she argued before the Supreme Court. Her legal victories had desegregated schools, universities, restaurants, hotels, and transportation systems across the South. She had helped to dismantle the legal framework of Jim Crow, segregation, and had established legal precedents that would benefit generations of Americans. The ripple effects of her work extended far beyond the courtroom. The thousands of black students who were able to attend previously segregated universities because of her legal victories went on to become doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers, and leaders in every field imaginable. The restaurants and hotels that were desegregated because of her litigation became spaces where people of all races could gather and build relationships. The transportation systems that were integrated because of her legal work made it possible for black Americans to travel with dignity and safety. Perhaps most importantly, Motley's career demonstrated that the law could be a tool for justice and social change. Her meticulous preparation, brilliant legal arguments, and unwavering courage showed that dedicated advocates could use the legal system to protect the rights of the powerless and challenge the privileges of the powerful. She proved that the Constitution's promise of equal protection under the law was not just rhetoric. It was a principle that could be enforced through skilled legal advocacy. In 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Motley to the federal bench, making her the first black woman to serve as a federal judge. Her nomination was initially met with resistance from some senators who questioned whether she could be impartial in civil rights cases, but her confirmation was ultimately approved with bipartisan support. On the bench, she served with the same distinction that had marked her career as a civil rights lawyer, hearing cases involving civil rights, labor law, and criminal justice. The broader impact of Motley's career can be measured in the transformation of the American legal profession itself. When she began practicing law in the 1940s, the profession was overwhelmingly white and male. By the time she retired from the bench in the 1990s, women and people of color had become a significant presence in law schools, law firms, and the judiciary. While progress was slow and uneven, and significant barriers remained, Motley had helped to create a pathway for others to follow. Her story also became a source of inspiration for young people who faced discrimination and doubt. The woman who had been told she didn't look like a lawyer had become living proof that appearance, background, and the opinions of others were far less important than talent, determination, and the courage to fight for justice. When Constance Baker Motley died in 2005, she was remembered not just as a great lawyer, but as a transformative figure who had helped to reshape American society. The obituaries described her as a civil rights queen and an unsung hero who had made the United States a more just and equitable nation. Not the story of Constance Baker Motley reminds us that greatness often comes disguised in forms that society isn't ready to recognize. When that Mississippi judge told her she didn't look like a lawyer, he revealed more about his own limited imagination than about her capabilities. He saw a black woman and couldn't envision her as a legal professional. What he failed to see was one of the most brilliant legal minds of the 20th century. Motley's journey teaches us that the phrase, "you don't look like a lawyer," or a doctor, or a CEO, or any other professional, is really code for "you don't look like the people who have traditionally held these positions." It's a reminder that our assumptions about who can hold power and authority are often rooted in prejudice rather than merit. But Motley's story is also a testament to the power of persistence and excellence. She didn't just overcome the barriers placed in her path, she demolished them so completely that they could never be rebuilt in the same way. Every case she won, every precedent she established, every door she opened made it easier for the next generation of women and people of color to enter the legal profession. Today, as we continue to fight for equality and justice, Constance Baker Motley's legacy reminds us that change is possible when brilliant, dedicated people refuse to accept the limitations that others try to place on them. Her story challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and to recognize talent and capability wherever we find them. The next time someone tells you that you don't look like you belong in your profession, your school, or your dreams, remember Constance Baker Motley. Remember that the people who try to limit you based on your appearance or background are revealing their own limitations, not yours. You don't have to look like what came before. You just have to be excellent at what you do. And sometimes that excellence is enough to change the world.